Hello and welcome to the third in our series of architectural lectures based on the Victoria Mansion here in Portland. The focus of our lecture today is the Turkish smoking room, and I'm hoping to present to you the connection that I see between the Turkish smoking room, the architect and theorist Owen Jones and his ilk, the people that used to produce the historical treatises in Europe in the early 19th century. And particularly, we'll be looking at Owen Jones' The Grammar of Ornamentation, and the connection between the Great Exhibition of 1851, which was championed by Prince Albert and was held in Hyde Park in London. So let us dig in. First, I'd like to just do a brief review of some of the sources that inspired the design of Victoria Mansion that I mentioned in our first lecture. We opened this whole series of lectures with this painting, The Architect's Dream, painted in 1840 by Anglo-American painter Thomas Cole, who went on to become the father of the Hudson River School of Artists in the United States. He painted this piece for the New York architect Ithiel Town, who was one of the first to introduce European architectural styles to the United States for domestic use particularly. The connection with Victoria Mansion is that Henry Austin, Ruggles Morse's architect, actually began his architectural career in the offices of Ithiel Town. We also, in our first lecture, talked about those historical style reference books that architectural companies used. The idea of being an apprentice to become an architect was very much grounded in these reference books. And they were manifestos that emerged from Britain and mainland Europe. And we know that Henry Austin had many such style books. And of them, we highlighted Andrew Jackson Downing's Cottage Residences, which was published in 1842. And I referenced Owen Jones' The Grammar of Ornamentation, which was published in 1856. So for the purposes of this talk about the Turkish smoking room, I will be focusing particularly on Owen Jones' treatise, The Grammar of Ornament. And finally, the role of Gustav Hertha, who was the prototype of the concept of interior designer and who emigrated to the United States in 1848, roughly the same period that we're talking about with Jones and the Great Exhibition and so on. And he was escaping the revolutionary turmoil that was tearing through Europe at that time. Hertha would absolutely have been aware of these historical style reference books, and it is clear that he used that integrated design based on his deep delving into those treatises and source books that would have been prevalent in Europe even before the time of his departure. So as I said, we started this series in the reception room and dining room in lectures 1 and 2. And now as we look at the smoking room, we'll be again connecting it to Owen Jones. And I love that this image, this is a copy of a print by Winterhalter of Queen Victoria, Prince Albert and the royal family. And it's a later version of the one that we actually have at Victoria Mansion, just beyond the dining room. So Prince Albert was one of the champions of the Great Exhibition of 1851. And we know Victoria Mansion, we have the house, the painting of their Isle of Wight Palace, and so on in the mansion. So another thread that connects Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, and Victoria Mansion. Now, before we dig into Owen Jones and his deep research and expositions of design, I did want to just say that there would have been a reference to some people in the United States of the exoticism of Moorish Spain. And Washington Irving did do a series of sketches and tales called A Series of Tales and Sketches of the Moors and Spaniards. And it was published in 1832, so a number of years before the Great Exhibition and before Owen Jones's treatises. But still, it was a presentation of this wonderful sort of exotic Orientalist, idealized sense of Spain and its mystique, and Islamic Spain in particular. And here we have the frontispieces of the London first edition and the Philadelphian first edition that were both published simultaneously in 1832. And the illustrator, John Frederick Lewis, we have here, does capture the architectural shapes of some of these miradores or lookouts in the Alhambra Palace. And we can see these rather romanticized figures here sitting here. So this was a very, as I said, exotic, Orientalist, idealized approach to Islamic Spain or Moorish Spain, or Al-Andalus, as it was called at that time. But Owen Jones wasn't interested in romanticism or stylization, but not grounded in the reality of what he found in the Alhambra Palace. So who was this chap? Well, he was an architect and a design theorist who exerted a very substantial influence, as we'll see. He studied at the Royal Academy Schools in London and then apprenticed with a French architect, Louis Vuillamy. And like all gentlemen of his era, he did embark on a grand tour, but with a very specific research hat on. He did Italy, of course, Greece, and it was in Greece where he met a French architect, a young French architect called Jules Goury. And together they started to explore the use of polychromy, or multiple color, used by the ancient Greeks, the Egyptians when they were in Cairo, and then on in Constantinople. And then they continued and ended in Granada in southern Spain. And in 1834, they spent their time working together to do an intense and essentially groundbreaking visual record of the decoration and architectural style of the Alhambra Palace. So this wasn't romanticized. It was a very sort of scientific, deeply focused study of the architecture and style that were there. So unfortunately, Jules Goury died in 1834 in Spain, in Granada, of typhoid. But Jones then went on nonetheless to publish the fruits of his and Goury's work and research. And he posited their theories, presented their theories in this document, or in this publication, Plans, Elevations, Sections, Details, Alhambra. And this was published in 1842, 1845. And the Victoria and Albert Museum calls this one of the most influential publications on Islamic architecture of all time, which is pretty high praise indeed. And this was done, as I said, about 6 years before Herta would have emigrated to the United States. And so this was a piece that was really gaining traction in England and Europe. And it particularly caught the attention of the Prince Consort, Prince Albert. So what Jones was presenting was a really heavy argument for how polychromy can be used and how it fits in defining and developing fine art and architecture, that fusion of art and architecture. And as I've noted here, he was inspired by the tile work at the Alhambra and what he called the infinite possibilities for invention of design. So Jones wasn't interested in slavishly repeating or recreating styles of the past, but using them as a grammar, as we could see, the basic building blocks, just as grammar is in language, the basic building block for the structures of sentences, paragraphs, etc. So Jones saw these studies as these essential building blocks for innovation and design, but grounded in the most excellent of teachers, if you like. So his designs did attract the attention of, as I said, Prince Albert, who invited him to get involved in the development, the building of what would be the Crystal Palace, that was going to be erected in Hyde Park for the Great Exhibition of 1851. And here we see the front page of the official catalogue. You know, the exhibition of works of industry of all nations. So let's dig into that. So here we go. This is a watercolor of the interior of the Crystal Palace. And you can see the polychromy here, the colorful design. This is an enormous greenhouse type thing. It was designed and built so that it could be easily erected and then easily deconstructed at the end of the exhibition. And Jones was invited to put into practice his theories of color and architectural studies, based on his Alhambra studies. So we can see here that he used the primary colors, and he talks a lot about primary and secondary colors and how to use them to enhance and emphasize architectural structure. So here we see blue, red, yellow applied in careful and prescribed proportions in order to distinguish structure, iron columns, and creating depth and perspective within the building. So an awful lot of color theory and scientific analysis going on here. So here is a floor plan of just one tiny section of this enormous exhibition, this enormous Crystal Palace. So who are the masterminds behind this exhibition? Two, really. There was Sir Henry Cole, who was an English public servant, an art patron and educator, and he was a promoter of combining art and industry. And Prince Albert, who was famous for being a very forward-thinking promoter of innovation and the power of technology. They were both members of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. And in fact, Albert was the president of the Royal Society and Cole was a member. So together they cooked this idea of the Great Exhibition, and it was conceived as a celebration of art in industry for the benefit of, quote, all nations. Though in reality, it really showcased British manufacturing and for mainland Britain and also the British Empire. It had over 100,000 exhibits that were displayed if you went up and down all the aisles over 15 miles. And it also incorporated, as we see in this map here, geographically organized presentations. So we have, you know, Turkey and Egypt, Persia, Greece, next to Spain, Portugal. But then down here we have China, Tunis, Switzerland. And then down here we're moving away from or delving deeper into each of those. So here, France, we see plates, bronzes, China, furniture, carpets. So it was this huge compendium of presentations in these different exhibits, and it had an enormous influence on the development and adoption of architectural style moving forward. Here are some fantastic pictures, if you like, that were published by Nash, Haig, and Roberts. And they were called Dickinson's Comprehensive Pictures of the Great Exhibition. And they were originally painted, commissioned by Prince Albert. And you can see here, I've selected some that focus more on that sort of Orientalist aspect of the exhibition, the interest in the Middle East, the Far East, India, and so on, which of course, by this time, India was, you know, the jewel in the crown, as they say, of the British Empire. So the Great Exhibition was a huge success. It was, people didn't really know what to expect, how it would play out, but it was an enormous success. As I said, there was the scale of it. You know, the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park was, you know, 1,850 feet long, and it was 108 feet high. It had over 100,000 exhibits, as I said, that if you walked every single nook and cranny, you'd be on a 15-mile walk. It was a huge success in reach. It's over 6 million visitors, that's 3 times the population of London at the time, passed through the gates of the Great Exhibition. And it was enormously successful in profit. And in fact, the profits or some of the profits of the Great Exhibition went to buy the land, the 87 acres down in South Kensington, where we have the Victoria and Albert Museum, the National History Museum, and the Science Museums, along with the Royal College of Art and Music. And right behind that is the Albert Hall, which was built after Albert's death, and the Albert Memorial. And again, this is another indicator of just how influential this event and Albert's patronage, if you like, had in the development of art and architectural design, so that the treatise of Owen Jones and so on really gained even more traction after this, after their exhibition and so on at this great event. And over here on the right, after the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park was dismantled, it was dismantled and then moved to Sydenham in South London. And in there, Owen Jones actually recreated a version of the Alhambra Palace based on his treatise. And we can see it right here in this photo taken in 1854. So Owen Jones really is a really important figure to understand, I believe, in the how we see the Turkish smoking room in the Victoria Mansion today. So after his Alhambra treatise, he then put together this gargantuan work called the Grammar of Ornament, General Principles in the Arrangement of Form and Color in Architecture and the Decorative Arts, which are advocated throughout this work. So this was published in 1856, 5 years after the Great Exhibition. And we're bringing together the idea of art and architecture, just as we found in Gustav Hertha's work, the idea of art and craft. It's the elevation of art in craft. And again, as I mentioned earlier, just as grammar, language grammar is the foundation of composing written or oral language. So Jones was basically using this source book, presented this design source book as the structural elements, be it color, form, shape, that could then be dissected, recategorized by historical period and style, and then help to serve as an inspiration for the fusion of and development of art and architecture. As he put it, he said, the material expression of the wants, the faculties, and the sentiments of the age in which it is created. Again, emphasizing his sense that he wasn't espousing people recreating former styles, but using the integrity, the purity of those and the imagination of those styles in order to be able to develop buildings that were relevant to and consistent with the sentiments of the age in which they were created. And Victoria Mansion is a perfect example, in my opinion, of that, the incorporation of styles that were historically grounded, but that really met the wishes and desires of Ruggles Morse. So in this grammar of ornament, before he even goes into the various sections that he'll be digging into stylistically, he has presented 37 what he called propositions. And I've listed a number here that I feel are particularly relevant to our discussion of the Turkish smoking room. So proposition 1, decorative arts arise from and should be properly attendant upon architecture. So art, architecture. Proposition 4, true beauty results from the repose which the mind feels when the eye, the intellect, and the affections are satisfied from the absence of any want. We'll see how that applies to the smoking room. Proposition 8, all ornament should be based upon a geometric construction. Proposition 10, harmony of form consists in the proper balancing and contrast of the straight, the inclined, and the curved. So we're talking about the line structural elements. Proposition 11, in surface decoration, all lines should flow out from a parent stem. Every ornament, however distant, should be traced to its branch and root. And the italics, Oriental practice, are Owen Jones, not mine. Proposition 12, all junctions of curved lines with curved or of curved lines with straight should be tangential to each other. And again, his italics, natural law, Oriental practice in accordance with it. Proposition 14, color is used to assist in the development of form and to distinguish objects or parts of objects from one another. 15 also has to do with color. Color is used to assist light and shade, helping the undulations of form by the proper distribution of the several colors. And we saw that in the interior that he designed for the Great Exhibition, and we'll definitely see it in the smoking room at the mansion. Proposition 16. These objects are best attained by the use of primary colors on small surfaces and in small quantities, balanced and supported by the secondary and tertiary colors on the larger masses. And finally, Proposition 36. The principles discoverable in the works of the past belong to us, not so the results. It is taking the end for the means. So let's continue. Now, in the grammar of ornament, Owen Jones, I think, does a very fine job of helping us unbundle those macro terms, if we like, of Oriental or Islamic nomenclature. We talk about the Turkish smoking room. What does the Turkish adjective refer to? Is it Turkish style? Is it the tobacco? We'll dig into that a little bit. So the grammar of ornament is after the propositions and principles is broken into 20 chapters, and it's a huge range that reflects, the range of Owen Jones's expertise and also his grand tour. So the first one is the ornament of savage tribes, and then we move through the Greek ornamentation, Roman, Indian, Chinese, Hindu, and he spells it that way, Hindu. Then it goes through medieval, Renaissance, and so on. And then the final chapter is the leaves and flowers from nature. So a huge range. For our purposes here, I'm going to focus on 4 chapters that he identifies as very specifically and as very separate. And we talk about the Arabian, the Turkish, the Moresque, as he calls it, and the Persian. And I'm hoping that this will help us sort of dissemble or unbundle a little bit the idea of Islamic art and architecture versus Oriental versus Turkish. And I'm going to just focus on how he presents each of these 4 styles of ornamentation. And he's a man of very strong opinions, as we will see in each of these next slides. So chapter 8 of the ornament, of the grammar of ornament, is Arabian Ornament. And I've quoted some sections of his description there. And the first is, in the buildings which they constructed partly of old materials, they endeavored in the new parts of the structure to imitate the details borrowed from the old buildings. The same result followed as had been taken already in the transformation of the Roman style to the Byzantine, and the imitations were crude and imperfect. But this very imperfection gave birth to a new order of ideas. They never returned to the original model, but gradually threw off the shackles which the original model imposed. The Mohammedans, a very 19th century term, very early in their history formed and perfected a style of art peculiarly their own. And this ties, I think, to Proposition 36, that the principles discoverable in the works of the past belong to us. Not so the results. It is taking the end for the means. And here we see some of those very close studies that developed out of his Alhambra studies. Then chapter 9 breaks out Turkish ornament. And again, listen to what Owen Jones says. He pulls no punches. The architecture of the Turks, as seen at Constantinople, is in all its structural features mainly based upon the early Byzantine monuments. Their system of ornamentation, however, is a modification of the Arabian, bearing about the same relation to this style as Elizabethan ornament does to Italian Renaissance. And this is my underlining here. When the art of one people is adopted by another, having the same religion but differing in natural character and instincts, we should expect to find a deficiency in all those qualities in which the borrowing people are inferior to their predecessors. And thus it is with the art of the Turks as compared with the art of the Arabs. So Owen Jones pulls no punches. He really feels that the art of the Arabian Peninsula, and then ultimately, as we'll see in Spain, was of the highest quality. And here we are, chapter 10, Moresque or Moorish or architecture from Spain, Al-Andalus. And here's what he says. The Alhambra is at the very summit of perfection of Moorish art, as is the Parthenon of Greek art. We can find no work so fitted to illustrate a grammar of ornament as that in which every ornament contains a grammar in itself. Every principle which we can derive from the study of the ornamental art of any other people is not only ever present here, but was by the Moors more universally and truly obeyed. We find in the Alhambra the speaking art of the Egyptians, the natural grace and refinement of the Greeks, the geometrical combinations of the Romans, the Byzantines, and the Arabs. The ornament wanted but one charm, which was the peculiar feature of the Egyptian ornament, symbolism. It's pretty high praise coming from Owen Jones for this work. And these are just a couple of his very, very detailed designs. There are several pages, I just selected two, but we can see the geometry that he had espoused earlier. We can see the primary and secondary and tertiary colors. And this red and green combination here, I think we'll see has been adapted in our Turkish smoking room at the mansion. And then I selected finally from his chapter 11, Persian Ornament, as he called it. And this is what he says about this. The Mohammedan architecture of Persia, and just again, Mohammedan, he's talking about Islam as the religion. Moorish was a term, again, a 19th century term that was related specifically to Spain, and was like a construct of the combination of different tribes and so on that invaded Spain in 711. So lots of different terms that tend to get tossed around. But anyway, here we are, Persian ornament. The Mohammedan architecture of Persia does not appear to have ever reached the perfection of the Arabian buildings of Cairo. Although presenting considerable grandeur in the main features, the general outlines are much less pure, and there would appear to be a great want of elegance in all the constructive features. With the Arabs and Moors, ornaments with their inscriptions had to supply every want, and therefore it became of more importance in their structures and reached a higher point of elaboration. And his reference here, of course, is the prescription of images of human beings in Islamic-based art, so that geometry, script, and color were the elements that were used to be ornamentation in Islamic art. And Owen Jones clearly appreciates that. So here we are. This is a picture of our Turkish smoking room. And so we're going to see, are Owen Jones principles and propositions here in how Gustav Herter designed his concept for this room. Proposition 8, all ornament should be based on a geometrical construction. And I think we absolutely see that here. And we see the influence of the Alhambra designs that he had so closely followed, both in his first publication and in the Grammar of Ornament. Proposition 10, harmony of form consists in the proper balancing and contrast of the straight, the inclined, and the curved. And again, we see that. We also see the color palette, white, red, green, and this lovely yellow, these wonderful interlocking sections there. Let's continue. Are there more propositions that apply? As you look at this view from outside the doors, the sliding doors of the Turkish smoking room, Proposition 14 we had highlighted to do with color, and absolutely 15 and 16. Color is used to assist in the development of form and to distinguish objects or parts of objects from one another. And we definitely see that here with the designed shapes, and again, the color and the divisions that Herta implemented in this room. Color is used to assist light and shade, helping the undulations of form by the proper distribution of the several colors. We definitely see the undulations of form, and this color, we see the white popping out against the other contrasting colors. Proposition 16, these objects are best attained by the use of primary colors on small surfaces and in small quantities, balanced and supported by the secondary and tertiary colors on larger masses. We see some element of that here, but it is this wonderful synthesis of images, of color and so on, that really harkens back to what he did in the Great Exhibition interiors. And this is the ceiling, just looking up at the ceiling of the smoking room. And we'll see, Proposition 1, does it fit? The decorative arts arise from and should properly be attendant upon architecture. And again, this is the ceiling, but it has been integrated into the whole room with the same color palettes, the undulating designs, everything sort of going back to its root. The principles discoverable in the works of the past belong to us, not so the results. It is taking the end for the means. Yet again, we see that, I would say, here. And then this is from within the smoking room, looking out. And there's this wonderful, Herta did this brilliant thing with the stained glass here, echoing the distant stained glass that's on the at the top of the staircase. That wonderful depth, horizontal line. But in the context of this smoking room looking out, in surface decorations, all lines should flow out of a parent stem. Every ornament, however distant, should be traced to its branch and root. And there again, that's his italics, Oriental practice. And this wonderful red, white, and green just continues around and around and around. And the way that Herta designed the wall, the curtain hangings and so on, just really weaves in. It goes back to the central design that he had in mind, and I would say was inspired perhaps by Owen Jones. So color theory was huge to Jones and was what really attracted him to spending so much time in the Alhambra. And he has this wonderful quote, "Form without color is like a body without a soul." So we're not going to be getting into metaphysical things here necessarily, though I will take you on a tangent in a second. But form without color is like a body without a soul. It's pretty profound. And he particularly found that in what he discovered in Al-Andalus in southern Spain from the the Moorish period, 711 to 1492. And in the Grammar of Ornament, he says, the colors employed by the Moors on their stucco work were in all cases the primaries, blue, red, and yellow, aka gold. The secondary colors, purple, green, and orange, occur only in the mosaic dados, which being near the eye formed a point of repose from which the more brilliant coloring above. So Proposition 4 speaks to this, I think. True beauty results from that repose which the mind feels when the eye, the intellect, and the affections are satisfied from any absence of want. I think this is not only true in the Turkish smoking room, but throughout Victoria Mansion. Herta's integrated design, informed by these historical treaties, really did feed the heart, the soul, the intellect. And I think the Turkish smoking room is like a little jewel box example of that. Now, I said I wasn't going to get into the metaphysical, but it isn't. I did want to take a very slight little aside. Owen Jones talks about, decoration without, architecture without decoration being like a body without a soul. So what was the use of color in Islamic visual art, particularly book art? So the use of color terms in the Quran is mostly descriptive. The symbolic meanings are associated with colors and were derived from actually pre-Islamic times, before the revelation to Muhammad in the mid 600s. But there were 5 basic colors in pre-Islamic Arabic: the white or light, black or dark, red brown, yellow beige, and green blue. In the Quran itself, the colors referenced are white, black, red, yellow, and green. And according to this researcher Majid Danzenga, in his perception of color in Islamic texts and traditions, with particular reference to Shia, or the very mystical branch of Islam, Dangazar says that white represented purity, and that will be is agreed upon by many Islamic scholars. Yellow has got positive and negative connotations depending on context, and often yellow would be gold, in represented in gold in the Turkish smoking room at the Victoria Mansion. Red was energy and power and blood, and in Sufism it also represented the state of the divine presence. Green was the color of life, and you will see green a lot in Islamic architecture. And green is very prevalent in a lot of flags from countries in which Islam is the primary religion. So green is the color of life, peace, and prosperity, and it's a counterpoint to the red. In Victorian color theory, red and green were opposites on the color spectrum. So you had energy, but calm. And green is also connected to the idea of the Jannah, or paradise, to which every Muslim aspires after death. And then blue, or in Arabic, azraq, was actually not a noun, but an adjective that had this idea of something sparkling. So I thought that aside was interesting, just to sort of think about, well, what does color mean in Islam from a religious perspective versus cultural differences between Spain or Morocco or Peninsula Arabia or Turkey or Persia and so on. So maybe the word Turkish then does apply to tobacco. I mean, it was a smoking room, and Turkish tobacco was highly, highly prized because it had great flavor, apparently, far less nicotine, and was much smoother smoke. I will take their word for it. But I thought it would might be really interesting to see, well, how did we get a smoking room in a house in Portland, Maine? And the Turkish smoking room in the Victoria Mansion is the earliest documented example of a smoking room in the United States. So Robert Morse was way ahead of his time. We know he was an entrepreneur. We know that he was very well informed, based on his work in the hotels in New York and then down in New Orleans. He would have known whom to contact: Austin and Herta and Guidicini and so on. And he was really on the cutting edge of this, of design. So cigar smoking, first of all, came, and and that whole idea of France and Britain being involved in the Middle East at all came really with the Peninsular War in Spain under Napoleon, and then the whole sort of development through Egypt and so on. Before that, tobacco was basically either chewing or snuff taking, or sometimes clay pipe smoking. So 1804, 1813, the idea of cigars was sort of brought back to Britain by cavalry officers and so on. And again, the cigar, I guess it maybe still is, was a male attribute, associated with lightheartedness, banter after dinner, glasses of port, while the ladies would go off to the parlor or somewhere to have their little tete-a-tete soiree, and would not want to be affected by the frightful smoke. So cigarettes, they first appeared in Britain at, lo and behold, the Great Exhibition of 1851. And their 2 tobacconists, Bacon's in Cambridge in England and Simmons in London, have records of selling cigarettes as opposed to cigars. So where did the cigarette stuff come from? Well, it became really popularized because of the Crimean War. So that was 1854 to 1856. And 1856 was when the Grammar of Ornament was published by Owen Jones, just to keep us in the same framework. And smoking cigarettes was introduced to the gentlemen officers again, where they'd seen French and Turkish soldiers smoking, and it was far easier. Cigarettes were far easier to manage, and also it meant that because of that, the common man could also sort of start using them, and it was then considered, smoking then became sort of a generally accepted fashion amongst gentlemen, rather than something of an evil of the lesser class. It also sort of encouraged the sense of manliness and so on. And then Robert Clogue, a Crimean War veteran, opened up the first British cigarette factory and started producing them in Britain under the unexplained names of the Sweet Threes. So it's interesting that Bacons and Simmons were able to present and start selling cigarettes as early as 1851. So they were again on the forefront of this sort of exposure to what was available in other countries, which was what the Great Exhibition had been doing. Perhaps they were, they had already sort of discovered these attributes and so on in these various countries, and in Turkey, and were able to present them here pretty early, even before the Crimean War had taken place. And so the fashion did spread to the United States, displacing in some cases cigar and pipe smoking. So there's a little bit of the Turkish piece, Turkish tobacco. And in smoking rooms in Britain, and we don't know if Ruggles Morse would have had these wonderful outfits, but I thought it would be rather fun to just show the well-dressed smoker would often have one of these wonderful caps and these jackets, a smoking jacket, and they would often be made of velvet as well as silk, but the velvet would absorb a lot of the smoke. And again, notice the Orientalist style, this sort of Turkish, Ottoman, Arab sort of pastiche, if you like, in the style of these clothes. And here's a photo of the British entrepreneur and art lover, Sir Richard Wallace of the Wallace Collection in London, wearing his smoking jacket. Though this is in 1880, quite a bit after the time that Ruggles Morse had put in a Turkish smoking room in his house in 1858, 1860. So I hope that I've been able to sort of bring together the idea of how we have a Turkish smoking room in the Victoria Mansion. I hope we've sort of clarified perhaps some of the terms that go along with Orientalism, Turkish, Arabic, Islamic, and so on. And also, I hope that I've been able to weave together again that other connection between Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, and the Victoria Mansion. And to finish up, I would just like us to a reminder of quotes that I've used in the previous lectures that speak to all these elements and the indebtedness of the Victoria Mansion to the past. So Jacob von Falk, whom we've seen quite a bit before in his book, Art in the House, Historical, Critical and Aesthetical Studies on the Decoration and Furnishing of the Dwelling, published in 1874, so quite a bit after the construction of Victoria Mansion. Again, that being a nod to Ruggles Morse's being really on the cutting edge of domestic art, craft, and design in his house. So von Falk said, insofar as style is concerned, the modern Frenchman dwells in the 18th century. He sleeps in that century likewise, but he dines in the 16th. Then on occasion he smokes his cigars and enjoys his coffee in the Orient while he takes his bath in Pompeii. And I underlined Orient because, again, that's that very sort of 19th century, almost idealized folkloric approach to the mystique of the Orient. And then Owen Jones finally reminds us, to attempt to build up theories of art or to form a new style would be an act of supreme folly. It would be at once to reject the experiences and accumulated knowledge of thousands of years. On the contrary, and this is my underlining, we should regard as our inheritance all the successful labors of the past, not blindly following them, but employ simply as guides to find the true path towards that wonderful synthesis, that ideal synthesis of art and architecture. So that's the end of this lecture. Already on the Mansion website, we have lectures 1 and 2, the introduction to the historical founding of the house, the reception room and the dining room. This lecture should be going up shortly. And we also have the tour that former director Tom Johnson did of the house, and then a wonderful Victoria tea history and etiquette presentation. Upcoming will be a presentation on the parlor, and particularly looking at the amazing intersection of integrated design and thematic unity that Herta Guidicini and his cadre of artists were able to create, and which is now going to be revealed in glorious, glorious restoration. So thank you all very much, and I will see you at the next lecture.